Hello, I'm going to talk about the lecture, The Old Leaf, a New Page, Microcity Credits in the Conservation of the Prayer Book of Mary, Queen of Scots. In 2022, the Prayer Book of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was delivered for conservation. During discussing the future display, a question was raised if the binding of the prayer book can be restored to open it more easily, a very important issue when planning a longer exhibition. How to renovate and preserve the binding and the manuscript as a priceless whole while introducing significant structural changes. The aim was to apply as many non-invasive tests as possible before physically touching the precious book itself. And for this reason, it was decided to focus on computed tomography imaging. Application of microcity in bookbinding restoration is still very rare or non-existent, and this project is pioneering, applying it to the field. The goal of the project was to develop microcity imaging as a standard tool to diagnose and solve bookbinding restoration problems. The prayer book was made for Louise de Bourbon-Vendôme, Abbess of Fontevraud, in Paris around 1535-1540. As suggested by Dr. Emily Wingfield, senior lecturer in English literature and a renowned specialist of Scottish manuscripts at the University of Birmingham, the commission of this manuscript must be considered an early consequence of the new financial means and clerical responsibilities acquired by Louise de Bourbon in 1535 when she became the Abbess of Fontevraud. In the manuscript, in addition to the portrait of the abbess, that's her in the black coat, these prayers follow the use of Fontevraud, and the number of contained female forms suggest that the book was designed in particular for female use, an extraordinary occurrence at the time. Louise de Bourbon gave the prayer book to her grandniece, Mary Stuart, between 1558 and 1561. Mary Stuart ownership inscription on folio 206 is signed both with Mary's anagrammatic motto, Va tu mériteras, Mary Stuart, and monogram M-Phi, a variation, the M-Phi is like, it's here. A variation based on the initial M of Mary and phonetic initial Phi of Francis II, her husband. It follows that Mary Stuart must have added the inscription after her wedding on July 10, 1558, and likely before her definitive return to Scotland in August 1561. This illuminated manuscript on vellum is written both in Latin and French. Measuring 11.8 to 7 to 4 centimeters, it consists of 28 signatures with bare parchment and papers of 2 leaves, front and back. It was illuminated by one of the most sought-after artists of the court of King Francis I, master of the Archbishop de Rouen, active in Paris between 1525-1546. Rebound in translucent vellum at the turn of 18th and 19th century at the bookbinding workshop of Edwards of Halifax, with the narrative scenes painted on grisaille, characteristic of the method patented by James Edwards in 1785. New binding turned out beautifully and was preserved until today almost intact, but it also caused significant trouble to the vellum pages and to the exhibiting possibilities. The folios were all strained and distorted near their spines, and the book couldn't be opened wider than 30 degrees on most of the pages. Overcast stitching ripped at the delicate vellum, causing tears and losses, and it made it impossible to inspect the folds of vellum pages to assess the spine's condition, the crucial factor in weighing up the chances of recreating a new sewing on tapes. It was believed that changing the sewing method to a less stressful one would result in an easier working book block. The first CT scans were performed on a medical Siemens scanner at the Cardiology Institute in Warsaw in cooperation with the hospital scientific department. Oh, sorry. That's the patient. Depending on the viewing filters of the image analysis software used to examine the scans, different structural aspects of the bookbinding were revealed, though the resolution of the image wasn't at all what was desired. The thread and the spines could not be observed, except for other binding structures. While searching for a better scan resolution, it was decided to explore microcomputed tomography and further study the parts hidden in the manuscript spine. Micro-CT scans were performed at the Faculty of Materials Science and Engineering at the Warsaw University of Technology by Dr. Jakub Jaroszewicz with the assistance of Professor Chiara Mazzocchi from the University of Warsaw. At first, it was difficult to fully understand what was visible on the book spine. It was even a little disappointing not to find the regular stitches that should have been so clearly there. Not only the spines of the sections weren't visible, but also no regular thread course was found at any depth of the scan. The manuscript spine manifested a crisscross mesh of short lines set in many directions and only short straight threads in the spine incisions area. That's like I don't know if it's really visible, but the bigger incisions, you can see like tiny lines here. On the vertical cross-section of the micro-CT scan, 3 deeper indentations and 2 shallower ones along the spine length are interesting suggestions of the possible original 16th century sewing method or other later performed rebindings. The spine might have been cut in to prepare holes for sewing on recessed bands. This type of sewing was already applied in the 16th century to obtain a flat spine. Originally, the prayer book of this size might have had 3 recessed sewing supports, probably of twisted leather or linen cord. 2 shallower incisions could correspond to a different sewing introduced during another later rebinding but preceding the 18th century treatment. Also, the distance measured between the main support holes helped to estimate the amount cut off from the edges during the 18th century rebinding. It's here. It will be visible clearly afterwards when I show you the illuminations, how much was cut off. What kind of bookbinding procedures were executed at the Edwards workshop? The manuscript must have been somehow separated into multiple single folios. Either it was already the condition of the book at the time, or the spines of the pages were removed during preparatory operations at the workshop, like mechanical cleaning of the book spine from previous layers of the lining glue. The bookbinders must have known that the vulnerability of the vellum made wet procedures near on impossible. Therefore, they probably cleaned the spine with a knife or other abrading tool, and that action must have deprived the fragile leaves of their spines. Some folios were still linked in 1 or 2 places, sometimes just hanging by the proverbial thread. The single leaves were arranged and stacked into sections, attempting to preserve the original octavo quire makeup, 8 folios in each section. The amount of pages inside sections varied throughout the book, but it's obvious that the Edwards bookbinders did try to preserve the original order, with few exceptions. Bearing in mind the idea to keep the sewing aesthetic of the 16th century bookbinding, it was analyzed if sewing on textile tapes would be flexible enough and sufficiently accreditable to this period. Cotton ribbons would replace the stiff parchment sewing bands and allow more elasticity to the spine. To restore the easy opening of the book, also many spines would have to be reconstructed first to allow for carrying out regular sewing on textile bands. The renewed quire makeup was prepared according to Christie's auction description. The manuscript was last sold at Christie's auction, and they prepared like very specific description, and consulted with the prayer book owner and other specialists. Misbound folios, appropriate locations were established to allow reintroduction in proper sections. Manuscript disassembling began by detaching the book block from the parchment covers. The least invasive or harmful way to disconnect them was found along the middle of the blue end bands and papers. It would cause almost no damage to the interior of the manuscript and the covers. This action exposed parchment sewing bands underneath with a printed paper lining that was visible with a fragment of psalter. Parchment sewing bands were partially split in 2, and typically for vellum bindings, its thinner stripes were interlaced through the French joint. The sewing threads were cut off along the parchment bands on the spine. This allowed the sections to be removed as a whole stack of leaves and to preserve their 18th century makeup. Then the overcast stitches were cut off to separate the sections into double leaves if their spines were still intact, or single if their connection in the spine was broken. It became apparent that out of 103 assumed spines, 74 would have to be fully reconstructed, and only a few leaves didn't need any repairs at all. Almost all the leaves bore dozens of tiny cuts at their folds, sometimes also losses or bigger tears caused by the overcast stitching. All the remains of the original thread were removed in surgical gloves and preserved to prepare sterile samples for carbon dating tests. At the time of disassembling, each section and leaf of the manuscript were documented and counted, and here came the most unexpected surprise. While counting and separating the pages in section 11 that reportedly should have only had 7 folios, the 8th one was discovered. It was attached to the back of folio 84. Nobody had found it existed for over 220 years. This newly discovered folio is a proof that during 18th century rebinding, the book was first sewn, had the edges cut and gilded, and only then the pages were numbered. It clearly shows that the leaves order was not premeditated, and it may also justify the occurrence of other misbound folios throughout the manuscript. The rediscovered folio had never received its own page number until today. It was called 84X, and the prayer book now boasts 207 instead of 206 pages. After disassembling, each section and leaf were arranged according to the new reinstatement plan to return misbound folios to the proper locations. Reintroduced leaves were additionally paginated in pencil beforehand. While the leaves were still separate, XRF spectroscopy and RTI analysis were performed in collaboration with Professor Barbara Wagner from the Department of Chemistry of the University of Warsaw, Professor Kiera Macocki from the Department of Physics of the University of Warsaw, and Professor Mirosław Wachowiak from the Fine Arts Department at the University of Nicolaus Copernicus in Toruń. Those non-invasive measurements were performed to analyze the pigments and inks used in the illumination and text of the book. Inks and pigment analysis results are still being processed and will be the subject of a separate publication. To bind the manuscript together again, the reconstruction of, I think it's something to, yes. The reconstruction of 74 spines had to be performed. It was decided to use particularly 22-gram Kinugawa Japanese paper or 17-gram Kizuki Kozo and 6-gram Kizuki Kozo for small repairs or tears on the vellum page's surface, where the manuscript text had to be kept visible and uncovered. 33-gram Senkwa Japanese paper was used when the replacing of the lost parchment piece was necessary because it fitted almost ideally the vellum thickness, color, and structure. Only absolutely necessary vellum repairs were conducted. The wormholes or natural parchment flows remained intact. The sewing plan was designed to reflect most of the 18th century structure, but bearing in mind that the main reason for all this reconstruction was to create an easier opening of the book. Sewing was based on 3 flat supports, before parchment stripes, now cotton ribbons. In the 18th century, the use of rather stiff parchment was of no great importance to the manuscript functionality because the tight overcast sewing and the thick layer of glue on the spine held the book strongly together anyway. Spacing of sewing bands and changeovers was measured to reflect and use most of already existing holes after the past sewing. The sections retained their previous quantity of pages with the exception of those with reinstatement or removing of misbound folios. The book spine was rounded by gentle shaping as it was only slightly rounded in the 18th century binding. The spine was lined first with a layer of 35-gram kawashi Japanese paper, then cotton stripes were glued on. In the 18th century binding, the lining was used only to reinforce the spine, but now the stripes were cut a bit longer to act as an additional support in joining the book block to its covers. The prayer book was repositioned in the press to allow reattaching of the endbands and the bookmark, and gilding of the edges where the new spines of Japanese paper was added. Bearing in mind that the area to retouch was relatively small, the gilding was recreated using Japanese Kuretake gold watercolor, found to be the best visually, the least invasive and reversible gilding option possible. Thin stripes of parchment sewing bands were reused as originally, woven through the front joint in their respective places and fixed with animal glue. Small tears and losses in the vellum covers were fixed and infilled with 35-gram kawashi Japanese paper to prevent those places from further damages. And finally, new sewing expectedly gave the book block premeditated and desired flexibility. So what you can see how much was cut off from the prayer book. That's what I told you on the previous slides. When the micro-CT scans were performed after renovation, looking at the photos, it became apparent that what proper bookbinding elements were missing on the pre-renovation scans and what it meant for the manuscript condition. Here you can see the loops of the spines, and the tiny dots inside is the thread of the sewing. This project benefits from collaboration of art conservation and applied physics similarly to patient-hospital relations through a harmless evaluation of the condition. Bookbinding details hidden in the spine area often bear the answer how to address the book restoration task, what precautions should be considered. We should admittedly know that the conservation treatment we will finally choose is viable and will improve the overall condition of the object. Micro-CT scanning can truly become the visual analysis tool the book conservators were waiting for, providing us with additional and invaluable restoration guidelines. Thank you.